Good afternoon, everyone. It's Archivist David Thomas at Kresen, Kernow at Madruth. I hope you're all well and staying safe. I'm going to talk to you about manorial records, manorial documents that we hold here in Cornwall Record Office, or Kresen, Kernow at Redruth. And let's just ask ourselves a question, what we think of is or as a manor. And we might have a vision of a manor as a nice country house at the end of a lane, a big house in a village, and somewhere where it's a prominent structure or a building. But in a sense, a manor is a unit of land owing common obedience to a landlord and to whom rent is paid. And the documents I'm going to talk about were generated in the internal administration of the manor. They are protected by law, and those records include court rolls, rentals, surveys, maps, and all the other documents that relate to the boundaries, the customs, and the courts of a manor. And the records are a wonderful source of information about local communities and places, and can provide details on such topics: family history, finance, agriculture, crime and punishment, and yes, land ownership, obviously. So look at manors in the context of local government. And I like to look at this in a three-stage process. First come the ancient 9 administrative hundreds of Cornwall, created in Saxon times and possibly even before that. Then come the manors themselves, and the manors follow on from the hundreds, and they are units of government. And lastly, the system that perhaps we're most familiar with is the parish system. And we tend to think of places, Redruth, St Agnes, Bodmin, and all these parochial units. But those units are essentially created as a result of the Norman church reorganization of the 12th century. So they are the third unit of local government in Cornwall. And the number of manors are mentioned in the Domesday Book of 1086, the great survey of that time. And for example, here in Redruth, you would find manors like Trelay and Tolgus that are prominent in this area around where we're sat doing our talk today. And taking as an example, the 100 of Penwith, the westernmost part of Cornwall, in 1086, just run through the list of the manors that we have mentioned there. Aiglasbury, which becomes, of course, St Berrian, a very important manor in the west of Cornwall. We have Bennerton, which is Binnerton, a place in the parish of Crowan latterly. We have a manor of Worselin, which is modern equivalent is the manor of Girlin. We have Landical or Lanisley, which is the great manor centered around Gulval. We have Ritworry, which becomes in more modern times Roseworthy. And then we have a very important manor, Conarditon, which becomes Connerton itself. And Connerton originally was the old name of the 100 of Penwith, the western part of Cornwall. And it changed in the time of King Henry II. And then Teddentone, which we would know today as Tehiddy, a very, very important manor indeed. Lancleuch, which becomes Nanskeuch in more modern times. Shellannock, which becomes Kalinek. Brett, which becomes Bray. Truel, which is Truffle. Ludduam, which is Ludgvan. Alverton, which becomes the manor of Alverton. And then some change quite noticeably. Odenol becomes the manor of Uthno, and we would call that today Perranuthno. And Witterstan, which is actually the place of White Sand Bay, down near the Land's End. So we have all of those manors just in that part of Cornwall. And currently, an archivist, Kate, has been working on a National Archives project to create a comprehensive database of Cornish manors and Manorial Documents. And there are potentially around 1,165 manors in Cornwall itself. And those documents created as a result of the administration of those manors are subject to special legal status. They cannot be sold on the open market or sold abroad without special permission, because they need to be retained as legal evidence of title, and especially in systems where copyhold tenure prevailed. And more about that very shortly. How do I change the next slide? So what are the manorial documents? We've covered that in the sense you've got some of the screen showing here. We've got stewards' ledgers, we've got court rolls, and we've got part of a manor plan of Tehiddy. And then this next slide shows what is actually the oldest document in the custody of Kresen Kernow. This is a plan to do with a lawsuit concerning a place called West Down in Cardinham, just east of Bodmin. It's a wonderful map, and I like to sometimes think of this as Cornwall's version of Mappa Mundi, which you can see if you go to Hereford Cathedral. But here you've got a wonderful description of the lands in around 1566. We can date this fairly precisely because it's mentioned in some documents in the Arundel archive. And for example, we've got the churches shown at Bodmin and Cardinham and Blisland, the road from Cardinham to Bodmin and Blisland, and also to Launceston, and also the West Down. And shown also is a place called Helen Wallace, and Cornish house called Devioch of the manor of Cardinham. And then the Lord's Bound called the Great Ditch, and a dead broken rue called Devioch Sheep House. And the trees and the houses and the churches and the hedges are very finely drawn on this manor, on this map. And we've got some clues about other parts of dating this, in the sense that the watermark on this particular piece of paper, which is on this map, is one similar to another dated document of 1535. So somewhere between 1535 and 1566, this actual item was created. I remember when the Arundel Archive came to Cornwall Record Office in 1992, this particular plan was all screwed up in a ball and had to be flattened out and ironed out to get it to this state, and then completely repaired. But it is a very historic plan and a map of Cornwall. And here's an enlargement of some of the detail of the map. And the T-shaped object in the middle of that map is actually the gallows for hanging that stood in the road on that part of Cardinham Down. In the top right, we've got little church there, and also some of the fields. And rather nicely, in the middle, we've also got the gates here shown. Rather, very quite modern looking, actually. And if you think this is the mid-16th century, those gates don't look that different to what you would see in a farm today in the area. And then you've also got some wonderful estate atlases in the custody of Kresen Kernow. But this is the manor of Alurkey, which covered lands in the parishes of Bury and Ruin Lanahorn down on the Roseland Peninsula. And the map maker is a man called George Withiel. This map can be dated to around 1690. And we've got wonderful sea monsters, mermaids, ships, and compass roses shown on the map. This is actually a bound volume, and the map that you can see on the screen now folds out from the book and shows this wonderful panorama of the manor itself. And here's some of the detail from that. You've also got the offshore ships with their flags showing. And then to the left of the image, you have our resident Lurkey Manor mermaid with her tail and her headdress showing. And there are also fishermen with their nets in the boat at the bottom left. So it's a depiction of around 1690 of part of the manor's offshore premises at that time. Other manorial documents include court rolls, obviously, which record the business, transaction of business of the manor. But there are some wonderful court books as well, which are key documents in enabling us to prove the existence of a particular manor. Because as I said at the beginning of the talk, a manor's definition is a right to hold a manorial court. And the minutes of the courts are usually in quite a distinct form. They list the tenants, the names of the jury, court presentments, matters brought before the manorial court. The deaths of tenants are noted, and this is especially important in Cornwall, where tenancies were held quite often on 3 live lease basis or 99 years, and the surrender of the premises back to the landlord. And the court baron, another name for the manorial court, usually met every 3 to 4 weeks and dealt with the day-to-day running of the manor, including the customs, the admission and the surrender of new tenants, copyhold leases and payments of rents, and heriots, which were fines on the death of one of those 3 lives of the lease. And all the tenants were summoned to attend. And a court leet was also the manorial court, which usually met twice a year and had the right to deal with minor criminal offences and hold view of frank pledge. And the fine book on the screen covers the years 1756 to 1798, and it's part of the court book of the manor of Tehiddy. And when the new Lord Francis Bassett took over in 1756, he proceeded to discover all the manorial rights and privileges and customs that he could, and he wrote them down in the front of this book. And this particular extract relates to the year 1766 and refers to several lots of wrecked timber found in the sea off manorial property, half of which was delivered to the lord of the manor, as well in one case here as a seal that was caught, possibly near that cove at Codrevy, where is well visited today to view the seals. And the Bassets, as lords of the manor of Tehiddy, were often in conflict with over-wrecked items with the Arundels of Lanherne, who were based in Morgan and Pyder, who, because they held the great manor of Connerton, which had the right of wreck around the 100 of Penwith from the stream at Perranporth right down to Perrannuthnow. All of that belonged to them, but the Bassets claimed right of wreck over their manor from Porthtowan right down to Codrevy. Potential conflict, and a little more of that later on. And one of the strangest customs that comes with manorial documents is the right of deodand. And deodand, from the Latin, usually means something given to God. But in fact, in practice, it was something which caused the death of a person or a thing on manorial property, was forfeited to the crown and in practice to the lord of the manor. And in this instance, in 1793, Grace Luke of Redruth, just up the road here from Kresen Kernow, in the Green Lane at that time, was thrown off her dark grey mare on manorial property and died as a result of this accident. The animal that caused the death on manorial property was forfeit to the lord of the manor, and John Ethorne paid 5 shillings for the same. And this, of course, was a custom that went right back to normal times, and it was finally abolished by the Deodand's Act of Parliament of 1846. And the reason Parliament passed that act was in fact because there had been a major train accident in Sonning Cutting near the town of Reading, where a large number of deaths had occurred. And the lords of the manor on which that happened tried to claim items from the railway. And people said, we've had enough of this ancient custom, and the Deodan's Act abolished it. There's another instance of this within the Tehiddy records, in that in 1767, one of the other local landowners, Abel and Gove of Trevenson in Iluggan, had been in dispute for many years with Francis Bassett over some land. And suddenly in 1767, he was thrown off his horse and died as a result of the accident. And Bassett, doing the decent thing, wrote to his widow and said, I'm very sorry to hear about the death of your husband. But he put a little postscript at the end of the letter and said, I beg to append my claim for the horse. It's an interesting insight into how manorial law worked at the time. The other instance of Deodan in this manner took place on the railway line from Iluggan Highway down to Portreath Harbour in the 1840s, where a wheel of a truck passed over the leg of an old lady who was collecting firewood on the railway line. And in fact, she was killed as a result. The wheel of the truck, which caused her death, was forfeit to the Lord of the Manor of Tehiddy, but in practice, the wheel remained on the truck and the value of the wheel was paid to the Lord of the Manor. Quite extraordinary things. One of the ways in which manorial property was held was by a system called Copyhold, which was in effect a manorial tenancy agreement. And smaller land holdings within manors were held by copyhold tenure. And this was the proof of title to copyhold lands that protects the manorial documents by law. That's why they're so important to be preserved. The land was owned by the lord or the lady of the manor, but tenanted out to people who lived on the lands themselves. And copyhold land could be bought and sold, inherited, left in a will, mortgaged, and settled on someone. But every transfer of the land was surrendered back to the lord or the lady of the manor before admitting the new tenants. The lord or the lady of the manor had the right to take fees from new tenants and receive payment on the death of one of their tenants. And the record of that transfer of land was written up in the manorial court rolls, and a copy was given to the tenant. And this is where the term copyhold actually comes from. Now, the process of admission and surrender is reflected in these records. And the process by which transfers of copyhold land were made in the manorial courts. The property had to be surrendered by the old tenant before the new one was admitted. And this process made sure the entry fee of a tenant was paid and the new tenancy was recorded. And in the document on the screen, dated the 25th of May, 1829, Thomas Drazais the Younger of St. Agnes surrenders his property at Gooninis in St. Agnes, which was held within the Duchy Manor of Tywern Hale, to the Lord, which was then taken up by admission again to himself and also John Drazais the Younger, almost certainly a relative, in consideration of the sum of £15. An admission to the premises was taken from the hands of the steward upon the delivery of a rod, which was held out by the steward. And once the tenant had touched the rod and took hold of it, in effect, that signified entry into the manorial land. And in fact, this system's quite similar to the transfer of by property by deed in the Middle Ages, whereby property was transferred by something known as livery of season, where the two people, the seller and the buyer, met in the field, and the person selling the property took up a clod of earth from the field and gave it to the new owner, and therefore transfer was thereby effected. And coming back to one of the local manors here near Kernow at Redruth, The huge Doomsday Manor of Tehiddy, called Teddington in 1086, was held by the Bassett family for some 8.5 centuries until 1916. It was very well mapped from time to time, and this plan of 1806 by James Mills shows the northwest section or division of the manor at that time in the parish of Camborne. The plans are beautifully executed, and they show fields, roads, lands, and many other topographical features, and they're useful for many aspects of local or family history. This was a really large manor. When Francis Bassett took up ownership of it in 1756, he made sure that all the bounds and customs of the manor were recorded in that court book that we saw earlier. And that included the right of himself and his family to hunt throughout Camborne, Iluggan, bits of St. Agnes, and also Redruth, and also Crowan. So this was a very, very large manor, and to do it all in one map would have been a very large plan. So it was broken up into sections and divisions and administered accordingly. So that's an enlargement of the area around a place called Menorah in Camborne, which originally it changed manorial name, which was quite rare in the sense that these lands originally, before 1755, were owned by the Harris family and the Arundel Harrises as a manor called Peller, but the Bassetts acquired them by purchase in 1755, and the lands were merged into the existing larger manor of Tehiddy. And this meant that after that date, this great landowning family owned all the land on the north coast of Cornwall between Porthtowan and Godrevy, and that included today the area known as the North Cliffs, which was in effect in their back garden and was not publicly accessible by general members of the public. In the Butler family collection that we hold, there are some superb plans done in the early part of the 19th century, and in some cases the late 18th century. This is a plan drawn in around 1818 to 19 by the Falmouth map maker Richard Thomas, and this was copied out from an earlier manorial plan produced by a surveyor called J. Pascoe from the 1780s. And this is an incredibly detailed plan showing every field, every lane, road, feature. And we've got, for example, within this Redruth area on sort of southern side of the parish of Redruth, we have smelting works, burning houses as they're called, stamping houses, the mill at Tulgus, the pool and the leat, the brewery where I'm sat this afternoon, the Redruth Brewery is shown in 1818, the parish church and churchyard, and there are also notes about the bounds or the posts showing the manorial boundaries and even how deeply buried they were. The fields on this plan or map are lettered and numbered, and there is a very detailed key to show who occupied what as a tenant of the Lord of the Manor. And the surrounding parish boundaries are shown, and also even the ownership of the hedges. And it also includes an acknowledgement to Mr. Butler as Lord of the Manor about dumping of waste from the mining stamps. And this is a very detailed plan on ink and parchment, superbly drawn. And just an enlargement of that, you have, for example, here on the top right, the brewery around the Redruth at that time. If you weren't familiar with these maps and looked at them, you would think that that was actually printed. It is actually hand done. And the skill used in this is incredible. And if you put a magnifying glass on them, as I've done on more than one occasion to look something up, the detail is very fine. One mistake in making this, you've ruined your map, and you can't afford to make a mistake. On the left side of the screen, you have Tulgus Mill at bottom left, and also towards above that is Copper Hill, which was a prominent mine later in the first half of the 19th century. And recently I had a query about some a house history in this area, and I was only able to solve this query that we had here at Kresen Kernow by reference to this wonderful plan, which provided the exact answer that the inquirer was looking for. And moving on, we have in the manorial documents that we hold the Stewards Accounts, and in this instance, this is for the manor of Arwennick, which covered lands at Falmouth, in Bewdock and Myler, which were the property of the Kimberley family. This document is 1742 to 1743. And the accounts on the right-hand page include dues paid to the manorial lord for ships using the quays in the town of Falmouth at that time. They didn't miss a trick because they actually were able to get some of the manorial rents out of ships merely just coming in and out of Falmouth Harbour, who paid dues to the lord of the manor. And remember, anciently Falmouth was not called Falmouth, it was Smithick or Pennycumquick, and was only created as a parish in 1663. But the manor of Arwennick went back far before that and into the earlier part of the more modern period. And this is a further account of the stewards in the 1740s. And what's interesting, if you're doing your history of your particular house in Falmouth and you can tie a property to a lease, for example, at top right, we have repairs continued at Emmett's house. And also there are repairs to those quays that we've mentioned, and also the fish sellers. And what makes this quite interesting is individual tradesmen who did the work on these properties are named with their occupations actually recorded. So for family history and house history, these are really, really important documents. And sticking with items in the Falmouth area, this is a plan of the manor of Penance dated 1769, and it was surveyed by a man called Simon Dell, who was a land surveyor in Falmouth. And the maps in this wonderful book, they're all colored and they include a compass rose and also a reference table. And they also record the field names. So if you're doing the history of a site, you can say, sometimes Kresen Kernow actually gets asked a question. We want to have a name for this new housing development. So this is the sort of thing that we might look at. We might look at the tithe maps of the 1840s, but we may also look at these manorial survey books which show field names way, way back. And they're a fascinating source of information. What's quite interesting with this one is the acres are shown in statute measure, which is an English acre, and also a customary measure, which is a Cornish acre, which was different in size. And this map is showing Penance and the area from Mainporth to Swanpool, and it covers Penance, the Mill, Penrose, Trenoweth, Goosegill, and Trelaverva. And the estate that it belonged to was the lands of James Modiford Haywood. And it also shows the mine workings at Swanpool. How many visitors to the busy summer beach at Swanpool would realize that there was a mine very close to within that beach and its area. And this is an enlargement from that 1769 plan of the manor. And this shows the footpaths. Any prehistoric barrows are shown. There are wells, whims for drawing water, and also the Swanpool beach itself, which we can see in the top right-hand slide there. So again, this is 1769, a very, very attractive and beautiful plan. And sometimes there are surprises in these manorial records, surprises that you might not think that you're going to encounter. And we quite like finding these unusual things in our records. And while searching through them for our project on manorial documents, this comes from the manor of Tregenna, And this is a payment for rent, not in money, but there on the right-hand side, it's in the form of seagulls. So you paid the rent in the seagulls rather than in financial cash. And this manor belonged to the Robarts family of Lanhydrock, who originally, of course, were merely Robertses, but became Robartses. And without any surviving leases or court rolls for the manor, we're a little unsure whether this form of payment was customary to this area, or maybe it was used to offset rent, but probably or possibly an early form of seagull pest control. And these gull rental payments can be found in the manorial records throughout the 17th and the 18th century. So is this local to this area, or was it just used in Cornwall, or was it some form of a peppercorn rent? And going back to the records of the manor of Arwennick, the rentals of the manor were usually a type of manorial survey of all the tenants, usually done on an annual basis. And they would list the tenants' names, the details of the land they held, and the rent due to the lord of the manor. And this rental book provides details of land transferred from the tenants since the rental of the previous year. And this is quite useful sometimes if you're trying to work out when properties changed hands or when someone moved into a particular property. The increases and the decreases in the rent are shown, and the combined list of rents due include a window tax and charges due for standings or stalls in the market. And sometimes you see houses in areas with windows that are either an architectural feature or they're actually physically bricked up. And this was a result of the window tax. On the left-hand page of this image documents the change in tenant, the description of the land and the yearly rent. And the right-hand page is an example of the increase and the decrease in rent. And these would other manorial documents, they would have been held at the steward's office itself or at Arwennick, which is of course very close to, if you know Falmouth, the large pyramid near the car park on in the sort of area around the town. And this slide shows a more modern example of a rental. This is the Pendarvis family of Pendarvis in Camborne. It's 1899. But the core of the estate was the old manor of Treslothan, but the page shown on the left includes receipts for another of the Pendarvis manors, which was the manor of Nancothan, which was in the parishes of Redruth and Gwenet. And this manor, small though it was, included the Redruth Wesleyan Chapel just up the road from us here, which is situated over the railway tunnel. And the trustees of the chapel paid rent to that estate of the Pendarvis family. There are also wonderful manorial surveys in our collection. And this is a survey of the manor of Landrake, right up in East Cornwall, last sort of little settlement you come to before you descend into Saltash and cross the Tamar Bridge. And this manor belonged until the dissolution of the monasteries in the later 1530s to the priory at St. Germans. It then became the property of the crown. And then in the time of Queen Elizabeth I, it belonged to the Killigrew family. And this document was created about 1580 when Henry Killigrew was lord of the manor. It's a very wonderful example of beautiful and neat Elizabethan handwriting. And the shame with this one is that the first 7 pages are missing. It's by an unknown surveyor, probably local, but the Cornish historian Charles Henderson, who died in 1933, found it torn among the muniments at Port Eliot House, and it was bound up in 1929 for the Honourable Montague Eliot. But you can see some of the writing rather clearly there, especially on the right-hand slide. And another great map maker of the 18th century who did manorial survey work was William Deutsch. He surveyed throughout Cornwall and the West Country. In 1737, he mapped the manor of Tihidi in 3 separate plans for the Bassett family. And this is probably the earliest detailed manorial survey of the area in the parishes of Iluggan and Camborne. Layout of the manor is here shown with the tables of reference, which give the field names and the details of all the existing tenants. He uses a rather odd system of letters and numbers for his fields and his reference work, but it is a very, very important plan for the local history and the topography of the Camborne Madruth mining area. Now, some of the detail on this plan in the collection is quite extraordinary. We have 3 ships drawn on the top of this particular plan by Deutsch, and this is a contemporary vessel flying the Union flag on the jackstaff on the ship, but also with a man being forced to walk the plank. You can just see him there on the left-hand side of the vessel. Someone's pointing a stick or a pistol at his back, and he's about to sort of be pushed off the vessel itself. There it is in context, showing the 3 ships at the type of the top of the map. But the detail in this, again, as a work of penmanship, is quite extraordinary. It's not drawn on paper, it's drawn on parchment. And if you can imagine a scratchy, old-fashioned nib pen just carefully etching this out on the parchment, it shows the skill and the patience that these map makers had all those years ago to get the detail, and in this case, the decorative detail quite right. And coming back to the question of the right of rec and manorial property, which we touched on earlier, the right of rec in technical terms of ships washed up upon the shore belonged to the crown, but it could be franchised out to the lord of the manor. Now that great landowning family, great Catholic landowning family of the Middle Ages, the Arundels, who continued as Catholics after the Reformation, they can trace their ownership of this highly important manor of Connerton, which gave its name to the 100 of Connerton, right back to the Pincerna family, whom they acquired it from in the year 1154. And with this manorial right went the right of rec around the whole coast of the 100 of Penwith, the western tip of Cornwall. And rec could be claimed, as shown here, on the north and south coast in an area measured from the shore where a barrel or cask could be viewed from the shore on a clear day. And the Arundels owned this property, this manorial right, until 1800. And in another of our collections, it's hyped up and in the sale brochure of 1800 as containing rights and privileges without equal in the Kingdom of England. And in the Arundel archives themselves, there's some papers here from 1755, which show the instances in the bottom right, where from Elizabethan times, the Vice Admiral of Cornwall's agents, they handed over wrecked items which they had taken up from the shore to the Arundel family. Now, in the archives of the Royal Institution of Cornwall in River Street in Truro, there are some papers about a case in 1676 about some wrecked timber on the beach at Codrevy. And there's the steward of the Arundels and there's the steward of the Bassett family arguing about who has the right of rec because of this conflict between manorial rights. And I think it was finally solved when they cut the piece of timber in half. One lord had one half and one the other. So there was this dispute about who had the property of the right of rec within this disputed area. One of the great documents that we hold here in Kresen, Kernow, and it's probably the finest atlas that we have as a manorial atlas and a collection of maps, is this atlas called the Stow Atlas of circa 1690. It's made for the Grenville family of Stow in Kilkhampton, up in North Cornwall by the map maker Joel Gascoigne. This particular map shows the Barton of Stow itself with a highly decorative compass rose and cartouche. And this is really one of our great treasures. And just looking in at some of the homing in on some of the detail that we have there, you have the compass rose on the right-hand side and the sort of heading and cartouche from the plan itself, beautifully colored inks, and the compass rose is showing the direction of the north side. A little more detail from the Stow Atlas. This is Stow House itself, not a trace of which hardly remains today, completely removed, and bits of it went to other great houses in Cornwall. And the late 17th century layout of the house and the gardens is shown, and the field names and the acreages are given. The second item there down at the bottom on the quay on the left-hand side shows a chapel orchard. So was this the site of a medieval chapel, which would have been taken out of use at the time of the English Reformation? And this plan, going back to Falmouth again, is a plan of Sir Peter Killigrew's lands in Myler and Bewdock in the manor of Arwennock. And again, it's George Withiel, the map maker. We think this is a 19th century copy. This map was lost for many, many years, but it resurfaced following the death of a local individual, and it was presented to Kresen Kernow. And a little more of the detail from it here we've got. At the very top left of what you can see on the screen now is the town of Falmouth, and halfway down the map and on the far right is Pendarvis Castle. And of course, Falmouth is a great natural harbour, and ships were obviously very much in fashion in this maritime nation in the 17th century. And it's a really, really good early plan of what the layout of the manorial lands was like, and in this rising Cornish town of the 17th century. A little more of the detail. We've got the map showing the compass rose, rather similar to the Stow Atlas, but not quite as elaborate. The title section on the bottom left, and some of the tenants' lands and their names. So again, with the key, you can work out exactly which manorial tenants are holding which bit of property at this time around 1690. Now, a few years ago, quite out of the blue, Kresen Kernow was donated this wonderful atlas of the manor of Lefrauda in St. Just in Penwith, dated 1832, and surveyed by J.H. Rutger. It had been discarded from a solicitor's office in southern England many years ago, but was literally rescued from being thrown away. And the quality of the draftsmanship in this plan is superb. And apart from the tithe map, this is the earliest known detailed map shown to exist of the town of St. Just. So this slide is the title page and an enlargement of the drawing at the head of that page. And Rutger, as a surveyor, worked on producing many Cornish maps in the early to mid part of the 19th century. And I shudder sometimes when I think that this document was nearly skipped. And this is a section from the Rutger Atlas showing the manor of Lefrauda, which of course was one of the old names for St. Just. The parish church and the plain and quarry, the round area to the left of the church, which is still very prominent in the town of St. Just, are very, very clearly seen in the plan, as well as the glebe lands. This is the full map of the manor, and it picks up certain contemporary features from 1832, such as the location of the original churchyard market cross outside the parish church gate, which is now inside the church gate, and the site of a potential now long lost prehistoric cromlech, indicated by the presence of the name Hewis and Coit at the bottom right hand of the plan. So the dairy farm, or the summer farm perhaps, by the Coit at the very bottom right hand side of the picture. And this is the cartouche from that 1832 Atlas by Rutger, with a very finely drawn pastoral scene. Again, one might be forgiven for thinking that this item was printed, but it is hand-drawn with coloured inks. And there are other beautiful examples in our collections. This is from St. Keverne in the Vivian Archive. And this is the plan of the Manor of St. Keverne of 1815, executed by the well-known mapmaker Charles Moody for local landowner Sir Vial Vivian, Baronet, of Trelawarren House in Morgan and Menag. Many, many coloured inks are used in its compilation. And examples of Moodys Menorah and other maps and plans can be found in our collections, ranging over the period from 1778 to 1832. And now a plea. In our collections, we have a photocopy of the long-lost Ustick Estate Atlas of 1778, drawn by Charles Moody, with property in St. Just. We would love to find out where this original of that Ustick Estate Atlas is of 1778. If anyone knows, please get in touch with me. I would love to hear from you. This is another manorial plan of the manor of Tolgullo, otherwise St. Day, in the parish of Gwenet, surveyed by William Hole in 1777. Is that St. Day depicted in the background as a city perhaps set on the hill? But these lands come from property owned by the Champernoun, the Hurrell and the Chichester families. And we mentioned before the actual archives of the Butler family with their wonderful plans and in their surveys. And these examples on the screen are shown from an 1831 survey of the manors of Pengersic and Tresila Mulfra in the parishes of Bray, Kernow, St. Hilary, Gulval, and Marazion, again drawn by Rutger. The quality of the work is of the very, very highest caliber, and this book is one of the best examples of this archival genre within the collections at Kresen, Kernow. And here we've got a variety of coastal and rural scenes. Note the rabbit at the top right-hand side of the screen, just under the word Madron. And before we come to the questions and answers, just a little bit more about the project that we're undertaking at the moment with the Manorial Documents Register, in which our archivist Kate Rose has been working on. Project is due to finish in January 2022, with a new revised Manorial Documents Register going live online to coincide with the centenary of the Law of Property Act of around June 2022, and is not currently available yet for Cornwall, but the people who wish to inquire can contact the National Archives website for further information. As I said earlier, we think there's around 1,165 possible manors for Cornwall, and Kent, near London, may something have of the similar size of manorials that we have. So far, Kate has been able to identify 475 manors as proven, where we have information held at Kresen, Kernow, and these have been added to our database. And all of those 1,165 manors are being researched to check if they were manors or reputed manors, alias names, or not manors at all. And hopefully the manorial histories that some other members of staff here have been valiantly working on will be attached to the revised Manorial Documents Register. And to do that, we use original documents and secondary sources to prove the existence of those manors. And just a final thing to say before the questions and answers. Let us end the talk by the same place where we began and refer back to the manor of Cardinham. And I'm going to quote from a very, very rare book in our custody, one of the very rarest books on Cornwall you can have, which is the 1750 parochial history for the county of Cornwall, compiled by William House. And I'm going to quote his words, and I apologise in advance for some of the politically incorrect language that you might hear. And he talks about the manor of Cardinham. He says this is held by customary copyhold or freehold lands for life. And amongst others had this tenure or form of land holding, that the widow of every tenant should have what was known as her free bench or her dower in all her deceased husband's lands, dum sola et casta fuerit, as long as she preserved her widowhood and virtue. But if she committed an act and had a child or was taken in the act of fornication, she forfeited her widow's estate or her dower. However, after those facts, if she came into the next manorial court held for the said manor, riding in backwards on a black ram with its tail in her hand, and spake these following words to the steward thereof, he was bound by custom to readmit her to her free bench or her state. And this is what she said: here I am, riding upon a black ram, like a base whore as I am, and for my crinkum crankum have lost my binkum bankum, and for my tail's gain am brought to this worldly shame. Therefore, Sir Steward, let me have my lands again. And House writes that within the memory of the last age, i.e. around 1700, a widow tenant of this manor who had a base or illegitimate child performed this thing, recited the words, and enjoyed her lands again as aforesaid. And this was also the custom of the duchy manors of Talskiddy and St. Cullen Major, East and West Enburn in Berkshire, Tor Abbey in Devon, and Kilmersdon Manor in Somerset. And it just goes to show the concept of manorial history is far-reaching, and there are some wonderful examples in our collections at Kresen Kernow about our long and wonderful Cornish history. And we hope that when lockdown eases, you will be able to come and enjoy some of this wonderful archival heritage once again. Thank you.